"Don't start it," she said quietly, her voice barely rising above the low hum of the control room, but it cut through the air like a hairline crack in glass. Richard Hale didn't even look at her, his attention fixed on the glowing panel in front of him, fingers hovering over a touchscreen worth more than most people's yearly salary. The room stretching wide around him in polished steel and white light. Screens lining the walls like silent witnesses, executives in tailored suits standing just behind him, waiting for the moment he would press start, the moment that would launch his company's newest energy system across 3 states, a project months in the making, a promise of millions, and at the edge of it all stood Naomi Carter, a mop bucket beside her, hands still damp from bleach water, her uniform slightly wrinkled, her name tag catching the cold overhead light. Invisible to everyone in that room except for the way her words lingered just a second too long. "Sir," she added. Not louder, just clearer, her eyes fixed not on him but on the panel itself. "If you start it like that, it's going to overload." A pause followed, not the kind that invites conversation, but the kind that exposes it. One executive shifted his weight, another glanced at the screen, but Richard finally exhaled through his nose, a small, dismissive sound, like brushing dust off a sleeve. "You're done here," he said, still not turning, his voice calm, practiced, the kind of voice that closed deals and ended conversations in the same breath. And for a moment, the only sound was the faint buzz of electricity running through the system beneath their feet. Naomi didn't move right away, her grip tightening slightly around the handle of the mop, not out of fear, but restraint, like someone holding back a truth that had already been offered once. "I've seen this setup before," she said, softer now, almost to herself. "It won't hold past the initial surge." This time a few heads turned, curiosity flickering for just a second, but Richard let out a short breath. "Sharper now. Security," he said, finally turning just enough for his profile to catch the light. "Escort her out." The words landed clean, efficient, practiced, and the room followed his lead, attention snapping back to the screens, to the numbers, to the future they believed they controlled. As if her voice had already been erased, 2 security staff stepped forward from the back wall, their shoes soft against the polished floor, and Naomi finally stepped back, not resisting, not arguing, just looking once more at the panel, at the sequence counting down in silent precision, 12 seconds, 11 seconds, 10 seconds, her eyes narrowing slightly, memorizing something no one else had noticed, or chosen not to see, as she turned, pushing the mop bucket slowly, the wheels squeaking faintly, the only imperfection in an otherwise flawless room, and just before the door closed behind her, she paused, not turning back, just enough to let one final sentence fall into the space they had already decided to ignore. "I hope I'm wrong," she said, and then she was gone. The door sealing shut with a soft click that echoed longer than it should have, but inside, Richard's finger finally moved, pressing the command. The system responding instantly, lights shifting, screens flickering alive with streams of data, the room filling with quiet satisfaction, numbers climbing exactly as projected, the future unfolding exactly as planned, and for a moment, everything looked perfect. The numbers climbed clean and steady across the main display, each digit ticking upward with quiet confidence, the kind that made people in expensive suits relax their shoulders just a little, as if success could be measured in smooth data flow. Richard Hale stood at the center of it all, hands behind his back now, posture loose, already shifting mentally to the next deal, the next call, the next expansion. While behind him, one of the junior engineers leaned closer to his tablet, eyes narrowing. Not in panic, not yet, just a flicker of something out of place, a slight delay between input and response. Barely a fraction of a second, easy to ignore unless you were looking for it, and most people were not. The system continued to hum, a low, steady vibration under the floor, like a heartbeat too controlled to be natural. Richard glanced briefly at the central graph, saw nothing but upward curves and stable output, and gave a single nod, the kind that signaled completion without needing applause. But then a soft tone cut through the room, not loud, not urgent, just different, a notification that did not belong to the rhythm they expected. The engineer's fingers paused mid-swipe, his screen flashing. A warning line so small it almost looked like a formatting error. He tapped once, then again, pulling up a deeper layer of diagnostics, his jaw tightening slightly. "Sir," he started, voice careful, measured. "The way you speak when you are not yet sure if you should be concerned." Richard did not turn. "It is within tolerance," he replied, already dismissing the interruption before it fully formed. The engineer hesitated, then nodded to himself more than anyone else, telling his own instincts to wait. The room settled again. Conversations resumed in low tones. Someone checked their watch, another adjusted a cufflink, and for a moment the system appeared to agree with them, stabilizing, smoothing out, the numbers aligning back into perfect order, as if correcting its own hesitation. But beneath that surface, something shifted, subtle, quiet, a redistribution of load that no one had programmed for. The kind of change that does not announce itself. It just begins. One monitor on the far wall flickered once, then again, so quick it could have been mistaken for a reflection, but the same junior engineer saw it. This time he did not speak right away. He zoomed in, isolating the segment, watching the pattern repeat, his breathing slowing, not from calm, but from focus, the memory of a sentence he had almost dismissed threading back through his mind. "If you start it like that, it is going to overload." He glanced toward the door Naomi had exited through, still closed, still quiet, as if nothing important had passed through it at all. "Sir," he said again, more firmly now, "there is a variance in the distribution curve." Richard finally turned his head, just slightly, enough to acknowledge but not enough to engage. "Adjust it," he said, simple, direct, the kind of solution that had always worked for him. The engineer swallowed, fingers moving faster now, inputting corrections, but the system did not respond the way it should have. Instead of settling, the variance shifted, spreading, like a ripple moving across still water, touching one node, then another, then another. The soft tone returned, this time joined by a second, then a third, layering into something less ignorable. Conversation stopped, not abruptly, but gradually, like a room realizing at different speeds that something had changed. Richard's gaze moved back to the main display, the upward curve flattening just slightly, not failure, not yet, but no longer perfect. And for the first time since the launch began, he did not look at the numbers, he looked at the pattern, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice he had already dismissed did not sound quite as small as it had before. The tones did not stop this time. They layered, one after another, until the room no longer felt controlled but held, suspended between order and something that had not yet decided what it wanted to become. The main display pulsed faintly, not flickering, but hesitating, as if each update had to think before it appeared. The junior engineer's hands moved faster now, pulling up deeper system layers, his screen filling with lines of data that no longer aligned the way they were supposed to. "Load is redistributing across sectors 3 and 5, he said, voice tighter now, no longer testing the room but informing it, a shift in tone that others began to feel without understanding why. Richard stepped closer to the central console, not rushing, not reacting, but narrowing his focus, the kind of attention that had built his empire from nothing. "Stabilize it," he said, quieter now, more direct, as if control could still be reasserted through certainty alone. The engineer nodded, adjusting parameters, rerouting flow, applying the exact corrections the system had been designed to accept. But the response came back uneven, not rejecting the input, just bending it, like a structure holding weight it was never meant to carry. One of the larger wall screens dimmed for a fraction of a second, then returned, and this time several people noticed. Conversation stopped entirely, the room shifting into a different kind of silence, not calm, but listening. Richard's eyes moved across the displays, not looking for success anymore, but for consistency, and it was not there. The numbers were still rising, but not together, not clean, small gaps appearing between values that should have been synchronized, like footsteps falling out of rhythm. "Sir," another engineer spoke up, this one older, more experienced, his voice controlled but edged with something heavier. "The system is compensating in ways we did not program." Richard did not answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the pattern forming across the screens, something familiar in the way it moved, not from his own work, but from somewhere else, something he had chosen not to hear. The memory surfaced without permission, not loud, not dramatic, just present. "If you start it like that, it is going to overload." He exhaled slowly, not in frustration, but in recognition, a subtle shift that no one else could see, but everyone could feel. Run a full diagnostic, he said, the command landing differently now, less dismissive, more deliberate. The team moved quickly, screens changing, data reorganizing. But the system continued to drift, not collapsing, not failing, just moving. Further from control with each passing second, the soft tones grew steadier, no longer interruptions but signals, consistent, undeniable. And for the first time since the launch began, Richard did not look like the man who had already won. He looked like someone trying to understand how something so small, so easily dismissed, had already begun to change everything. The diagnostic results did not come back clean. They came back layered, overlapping, like the system was answering more than one question at the same time. The main display split into multiple streams, each showing a different version of stability that did not agree with the others. One line steady, another drifting, a third lagging just enough to matter. The room tightened around it, not physically, but in the way people stood closer to their screens, shoulders angled forward, voices lowered to near silence, as if speaking too loudly might push the system further off balance. Richard stepped closer to the console now, close enough that the glow from the screen reflected across his face, flattening the sharp confidence he had carried just minutes ago. Where is it originating? He asked, not loud, but precise, the kind of question that demanded direction, not guesses. The senior engineer tapped through layers of data, isolating nodes, tracing flow patterns, his fingers slowing as the answer began to form. It is not a single point, he said, eyes fixed on the screen. It is the sequence itself. That sentence landed differently, heavier, because it did not point to a failure they could fix. It pointed to a beginning they could not undo. Richard's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in calculation, the kind that measured time against consequence. Then roll it back, he said, immediate, controlled, the obvious move, the safe move, but the engineer hesitated, just for a fraction of a second too long. We cannot, he replied, the words careful but firm. The system has already distributed the load across external grids. If we pull it now, it will not reset clean. A quiet ripple moved through the room. Not panic, not yet, but awareness, the kind that shifts everything without raising its voice. One of the side monitors dimmed again, longer this time, and when it returned, the data was still there, but not aligned, small delays stacking into something visible, undeniable. Richard's eyes moved across the screens again, not searching for control anymore, but for understanding. And in that search, the memory returned more clearly now, not just the words, but the way they had been said, calm, certain, without urgency, as if the outcome had already been decided long before anyone else noticed. If you start it like that, he repeated quietly, almost under his breath, and this time he did not dismiss it. He measured it. The engineer beside him glanced over, catching the shift in tone. Sir, he said carefully, there was someone earlier who mentioned a potential overload condition. Richard did not look at him, but his voice came back sharper now, focused in a new direction. Find her. 2 words, simple, but carrying a weight that had not been there before, the kind of command that does not come from authority alone, but from recognition. The room moved again, faster now, one staff member heading toward the door, another pulling up access logs, security feeds, anything that could trace where she had gone. But as the screens continued to drift, the tones steady and unrelenting, the truth settled in quietly, not as a realization that arrived all at once, but as something that had been there from the beginning, waiting to be acknowledged. And for the first time since the system came online, Richard Hale was no longer ahead of the problem. He was behind it, trying to catch up to a warning he had already chosen to ignore. The search did not take long, but it did not bring comfort either. Security footage pulled up on one of the side screens, grainy angles of hallways and service corridors, timestamps ticking in the corner like a quiet reminder that every second already mattered. A staff member leaned closer, scanning frame by frame until he found her, Naomi Carter, pushing her mop bucket down the back corridor, her pace steady, unhurried. The same quiet presence she had carried into the control room. She clocked out 12 minutes ago, he said, voice tight now. Badge exit confirmed at the south door. Another screen lit up, showing the exterior camera, the afternoon light washing over the concrete steps as she stepped outside, pausing for just a moment as if adjusting to the brightness. Then continuing forward, disappearing past the edge of the frame. Gone. The words settled into the room without being spoken. Gone not just from the building, but from the reach of immediate correction. Richard stood still, eyes fixed on the frozen image of the doorway, the space where she had been seconds before leaving, his reflection faintly visible in the screen, layered over the absence she left behind. Call her, he said, the command immediate now, stripped of earlier dismissal. Someone moved quickly, pulling up employee records, fingers tapping, scrolling, dialing. The phone rang once, twice, then cut to voicemail. The sound small but final, no answer. Richard's jaw tightened, not in frustration, but in something quieter, something closer to realization. Behind him the system continued its slow unraveling. The tones now steady, no longer alerts but a constant presence, like a pulse that refused to be ignored. The main display shifted again, values drifting further apart, the clean lines of earlier replaced by uneven spacing that no adjustment seemed to correct. We are losing synchronization across the grid, the senior engineer said, his voice no longer controlled in the same way, not panicked, but carrying the weight of certainty. If this continues, the system will begin shedding load to protect itself. Richard turned back to the screens, finally fully facing what was happening. The scale of it no longer abstract, no longer numbers on a chart, but something moving, spreading, beyond his direct control. How long? He asked, the question simple. But this time it did not come from confidence. It came from calculation. The engineer glanced at the data, then back at him. At this rate, less than 6 hours before critical instability. The number hung in the air, not dramatic, just precise, the kind that could not be negotiated. 6 hours. Richard's gaze shifted again, not to the system, but to the memory forming more clearly now. Her voice, calm, certain, not asking to be heard, just stating what would happen. And for the first time, he did not see her as a cleaner, not as someone out of place, but as the only person in that room who had understood what they were about to do. Get me everything she touched, he said, turning back to the team, his voice steady but changed. Logs, access points, anything she saw. The room moved again, faster now, driven by a different kind of urgency, not to maintain success, but to recover from a mistake already made. And as the system continued its quiet descent, the truth settled in fully, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. He had not just ignored a warning. He had dismissed the one voice that might have kept everything from slipping beyond his reach. The logs came in fragments, scattered across different systems that had never needed to agree before, timestamps slightly off, access points overlapping, a messy trail that did not match the precision the company prided itself on. One analyst leaned forward, isolating Naomi's badge activity, tracing her path through the building. She was in the west maintenance corridor at 8:14, he said, pulling up a still frame. Naomi crouched beside an open panel, not cleaning, not moving, just looking, her head tilted slightly, as if listening to something beneath the surface. The image lingered longer than it should have, long enough for the room to realize she had not been passing through. She had been paying attention. Zoom in, Richard said, his voice lower now, controlled but no longer distant. The image sharpened, revealing the open panel beside her, wires running in tight, organized bundles. A faint indicator light blinking in a pattern too subtle for most to notice, but she had. The analyst pulled the corresponding system log, cross-referencing the timestamp. There was a micro fluctuation here, he said, pointing to a dip so small it barely registered. Less than 0.5%. It self-corrected. Another engineer leaned in, following the data trail. That is where the sequence begins to misalign, he added, his voice quiet but certain. Richard's gaze did not leave the screen, the connection forming without needing explanation. She had seen it before they ever started. Not in theory, not in projection, but in the system itself, alive, imperfect, already signaling what it would become. Pull every instance of that fluctuation, Richard said. Faster now. Sharper, the command driven by something closer to urgency than authority, screens filled with similar patterns. Each one small, each one dismissed at the time, each one now part of a larger shape they had failed to see. The room shifted again, not just working, but chasing, trying to reconstruct what Naomi had understood in seconds. She followed the pattern. The junior engineer said, almost to himself, eyes moving between screens. She did not just see one issue. She saw how they connect. Richard finally stepped back from the console, just slightly, as if needing distance to see what had been directly in front of him, his reflection flickering across the glass, no longer steady, layered with the data he could not control. Can we isolate the sequence from that point? He asked, the question no longer about fixing, but about understanding. The senior engineer shook his head slowly, not without shutting everything down, and even then, the redistribution has already propagated. The words landed without resistance. Because they were not dramatic, they were final in a way that left no space for negotiation. The tones continued, steady, constant, no longer rising, just present, like a clock counting something no one could stop. Richard's eyes returned to the image of Naomi in the corridor, still frozen on the screen, her posture calm, her attention focused on something no one else had valued enough to examine. And for a moment, the entire room seemed to revolve around that single frame, not the system, not the data, but the quiet proof that the answer had been there before the problem ever began. Find where she lives, Richard said, turning back to the team, his voice firm now, not loud, not rushed, but carrying a weight that had not been there before. I do not need a number, I need her. And as the team moved to follow the order, faster now, more precise, the system behind them continued its slow, steady drift, not collapsing, not yet, but moving further away from the version of control they thought they had already secured. The address appeared on the screen in plain text. Unremarkable, just another line in a system built to track everything except what truly mattered. Apartment 3B, West Elm Street. The analyst read aloud, his voice quieter now, as if even the information itself carried weight. Richard did not respond immediately, his eyes still on the frozen frame of Naomi in the corridor. That stillness, that focus, the way she had seen something before anyone else thought to look. It did not fit into the world he understood, a world where expertise came with titles, with offices, with credentials framed behind glass. But she had none of those, and yet she had been right. Behind him the tones continued, steady, unchanging, no longer escalating, just present, like a reminder that time was moving whether they acted or not. Car is ready, someone said from the doorway. The words simple, but they shifted the room, turned it from analysis into motion. Richard finally stepped away from the console, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving with a clarity that had not been there before, the kind that comes when options are no longer theoretical. As he walked past the screens, the glow followed him, reflections of unstable data sliding across the polished surfaces like something alive, something they had lost control of. The elevator ride was silent, no conversation, no updates, just the faint hum of descent, and the reflection of his own face in the steel doors, less certain now, less fixed, the kind of expression that did not belong to a man used to being ahead. Outside, the late afternoon air felt different, heavier, not because it had changed, but because he had. The car door opened. He stepped inside, the city moving around him in steady rhythm, traffic lights, crosswalks, people who had no idea what was unfolding just miles away. The driver glanced once in the rearview mirror, waiting for direction. West Elm, Richard said, his voice even, controlled, but carrying something underneath it, something that had not been there before. The car pulled into traffic, merging into a flow that did not slow for urgency. Back in the control room, the team continued working, screens filled with data that no longer aligned, attempts at correction layering over one another, but the system continued its quiet drift, not breaking, not stopping, just moving further away from what it had been designed to do. And in that space, in that growing distance between intention and reality, Naomi's absence became more than physical. It became the gap they could not close with code, with commands, with authority. Inside the car, Richard's gaze stayed forward, but his mind replayed the moment again, not the dismissal, not the command, but the way she had said it, calm, certain, without needing to convince anyone. As if truth did not require permission to exist, the city blocks passed one by one, numbers on street signs ticking down, closer, closer, until finally the car slowed, turning onto a narrower street, older buildings lining the sidewalk, paint worn in places, windows reflecting the fading light of day. "This is it," the driver said quietly, the car coming to a stop in front of a modest building. Nothing remarkable, nothing that suggested the answer to a problem worth millions of dollars could be inside. Richard did not move right away, his hand resting briefly on the door handle, not from hesitation, but from recognition that what waited on the other side was not something he could command, not something he could control the way he always had. He stepped out, the door closing behind him with a soft, final sound, and for the first time since this began, he was not walking into a room where he held the power, he was walking toward the one person who had seen the truth before anyone else was willing to listen. The hallway smelled faintly of detergent and something older, like wood that had absorbed years of quiet living. The kind of place where footsteps echoed just a little longer than they should. Richard moved past a row of dented mailboxes, numbers slightly faded, names half peeled away, none of them meaning anything to him until now. 3B. The number sat at the end of the corridor, simple, unremarkable, a door like any other. And yet everything in him slowed as he approached it, not from uncertainty, but from the awareness that this was not a boardroom, not a negotiation, not a place where presence alone carried weight. He raised his hand and knocked, once, firm but not forceful. The sound traveled through the door and into the quiet behind it. No immediate response, just the faint hum of something inside. Maybe a fan, maybe a television turned low. He waited, not checking his watch, not turning back, just standing there as the seconds stretched slightly longer than expected. Then footsteps, soft, measured, approaching from within. The lock clicked, and the door opened just enough to reveal Naomi Carter, her expression unchanged, not surprised, not unsettled, just present, as if she had already expected that something would follow. "You found me," she said, not as a question, just a statement. Her voice the same calm tone that had cut through the control room hours earlier. Richard stood there for a moment, taking in the space behind her, small, neat, a lamp casting warm light across a modest living area, a table with papers spread across it, not random, but organized in a way that suggested thought, attention, and then his eyes returned to her, to the steadiness that had not shifted. "You were right," he said, the words direct, stripped of anything unnecessary. No introduction, no explanation, just the truth he had taken too long to acknowledge. Naomi studied him for a second, not searching his face for sincerity, but measuring something quieter, something deeper. Then she opened the door wider, stepping aside just enough to let him enter, not as an invitation, but as permission. He stepped inside, the difference immediate, the air warmer, the noise of the city softened by the walls. The kind of space that did not demand attention but held it. She closed the door behind him with a soft click, the same sound that had echoed in the control room earlier. But here it felt different, not final, just contained. "How bad is it?" she asked, moving back toward the table, her eyes already shifting to the papers in front of her, as if she had not been waiting, but preparing. Richard exhaled slowly, the weight of the situation settling more clearly now that he was no longer surrounded by screens and data. "Less than 6 hours before critical instability," he said, repeating the number that had been echoing in his mind. Naomi nodded once, not reacting, not surprised, just confirming what she already understood, her fingers lightly touching the edge of one of the papers, a diagram sketched in pencil, lines connecting nodes in a pattern that looked uncomfortably familiar. "Then we do not have time to argue about who was right," she said, her tone steady, practical. "We only have time to fix what you started." And for the first time since he had arrived, Richard did not respond immediately, not because he disagreed, but because the shift was complete. The space between authority and understanding had closed, and in that quiet apartment, with nothing polished, nothing controlled, the direction of everything that followed no longer belonged to him. Naomi did not reach for a laptop or a polished device. She reached for a pencil, the wood worn smooth from use, and pulled the paper closer under the warm light. The diagram already half drawn, lines intersecting at angles that did not follow standard layouts. But something more organic, something observed rather than designed. You built it to scale fast, she said, her eyes moving across the sketch, not asking, just stating what she already knew. Richard stood a few feet away, watching, not interrupting, not correcting, just listening in. A way he had not allowed himself to before. Yes, he answered after a moment, his voice quieter now. It was designed to handle exponential load growth. Naomi nodded once, then circled a section on the page, a cluster of nodes connected too tightly. That is the problem, she said, tapping the paper lightly. Not that it cannot handle growth, but that it assumes balance will hold while it grows. She glanced up at him briefly, not challenging, just making sure he followed. But balance was already shifting before you turned it on. The words settled between them. Simple, precise, the same clarity she had carried from the beginning. Richard stepped closer now, his eyes dropping to the paper, following the lines she had drawn, seeing something in them that the screens had not shown him. We saw minor fluctuations, he said, more to himself than to her. They corrected automatically. Naomi shook her head slightly, not dismissive, just firm. They did not correct, she replied, drawing another line, connecting a distant point back into the cluster. They moved. The pencil traced the path slowly, deliberately, showing how each small shift had not disappeared, but redistributed, building pressure in places no one had been watching. When you started the system, you locked those shifts into place, she continued, her voice steady. And then you added load on top of them. Richard exhaled slowly, the realization not sharp, but heavy, the kind that settles in layers. So, it was already unstable, he said. Naomi nodded again. Not unstable enough to fail right away, she corrected, but unstable enough that once it reached a certain threshold, it would stop responding the way you expect. She set the pencil down for a moment, letting the diagram speak in the silence that followed. Richard looked at it. Really looked, not as a report, not as data, but as something that had been trying to show him the truth all along. Can it be fixed? He asked, the question direct, but different now. No assumption behind it. Just need. Naomi picked the pencil back up, drawing a new set of lines, this time separating the cluster, rerouting the connections, not removing them, but giving them space. Not from where you are, she said, her tone calm, not discouraging, just honest. You cannot fix this from the top layer. You have to go back to where it started. She tapped the first point she had circled, the one she had seen in the corridor hours earlier. You have to interrupt the sequence at its origin, then rebuild the distribution before the load catches up. Richard's eyes followed her hand, the path forward forming not as a command, but as a process, something that required understanding, not just authority. That will take time, he said, the 6-hour window pressing quietly against his thoughts. Naomi met his gaze this time, steady, unwavering. Then we should not waste any more of it, she replied. And in that moment, the room, small as it was, held more clarity than the entire control center he had left behind. Not because it was better equipped, but because for the first time, he was listening to the one person who had seen the truth before it became a problem. Naomi stood up from the table without hesitation, the pencil still in her hand, not rushing but moving with purpose, the kind that does not come from pressure but from clarity. We need access to your control system, she said. Already reaching for a light jacket draped over the back of a chair, Richard nodded immediately. No negotiation, no delay. You will have it, he replied, his voice steady, but different now. Stripped of command and filled with something closer to trust, she paused for a brief second, looking at him, not to confirm his authority, but to measure his willingness to follow through. Then she slipped the jacket on and stepped toward the door. Then let us not waste the drive, she said, opening it before he could respond. The hallway outside still quiet, unchanged, as if the urgency they carried had not yet reached beyond them. They moved quickly but not chaotically, footsteps measured, the echo of them filling the corridor with a rhythm that felt more certain than anything inside the control room had become. The car ride back felt shorter, not because of speed, but because neither of them filled it with unnecessary words. Naomi sat in the front seat this time, her eyes focused ahead, not on the city, but on something internal, tracing the pattern she had already mapped out. Richard watched her briefly, noticing the stillness, the absence of doubt. A contrast so sharp it unsettled him more than the failing system. Back at the building, the lights from the control room spilled into the hallway before they even reached it, brighter now, harsher, reflecting the increased strain inside. The moment they entered, every head turned, not to Richard, but to her, recognition moving through the room in quiet waves, not of status, but of necessity. The senior engineer stepped forward. "System instability is accelerating," he said, voice controlled but tight. "We are at 4 hours before critical threshold." Naomi nodded once, already moving past him toward the central console, her presence cutting through the tension without raising it. "Show me where the sequence began to diverge," she said, her tone calm, direct, not asking for permission, just directing focus. Screens shifted, data pulled up, layers opened. The same patterns Richard had seen earlier, but this time, under her gaze, they did not look like noise, they looked like a path. She leaned slightly closer to the display, her hand hovering just above the glass, not touching it yet, her eyes moving quickly, connecting points that others had only observed individually. "There," she said, pointing to a section of the graph where the lines subtly separated. "That is not where it failed, that is where it chose a different path." The room stilled around her words, not because they were louder, but because they reframed everything. Richard stepped closer, following her indication, seeing the divergence not as an error, but as a decision the system had made based on its design. "We have to interrupt that path," she continued, already moving to the console, her fingers finally touching the interface, not hesitantly, but with familiarity, as if she had been here before in a different form. "If we let it continue, it will protect itself by shedding load, and you will not get it back." The engineers exchanged quick glances, not questioning her, but adjusting to a new center of direction. "What do you need?" Richard asked, standing just behind her now, not leading, but ready. Naomi did not turn, her focus already inside the system. "Full override access," she said, her voice steady, "and no interruptions." There was no hesitation this time. Richard looked to the team, then back to her, and gave a single nod. "You have it." And as the system continued its quiet descent, the balance of the room shifted completely, not through authority, not through command, but through the presence of someone who had seen the truth early enough to still change what came next. Naomi's fingers moved across the console with deliberate precision, not fast, not rushed, but exact. Each input placed where it needed to be, not where it seemed obvious. The interface responded differently under her touch, not because the system had changed, but because the intent behind the commands had. She was not forcing it back into alignment. She was listening to how it had shifted and guiding it from within. "Do not correct the output," she said calmly, her eyes never leaving the screen. "That is what caused this in the first place." One of the engineers hesitated, his instinct pulling him toward the controls he had been trained to trust. "Then what do we adjust?" he asked. Naomi paused just long enough to highlight a section of the system that had been overlooked before, a deeper layer, buried beneath the primary distribution logic. "You adjust what the system thinks is balanced," she replied, her voice steady. "Not what it shows you on the surface." The words settled over the room, shifting the way they were looking at everything. Richard stood just behind her, watching the screens change, not dramatically, but subtly, the kind of shift that only became visible when you stopped expecting immediate results. The uneven lines began to slow their divergence, not correcting, but hesitating, as if reconsidering the path they had taken. "We are interrupting the cascade," the senior engineer said quietly, almost surprised. Naomi nodded once, her hand moving to another section, isolating a cluster of nodes that had been carrying excess load. "Now we give it space," she said, rerouting the connection she had drawn earlier on paper, not removing pressure, but redistributing it in a way that allowed the system to breathe. The tones in the room began to change, still present, but less layered, less urgent, the constant hum shifting into something steadier. Richard noticed it before he understood it, the difference not in the data, but in the feeling of the room itself, the tension no longer tightening, but loosening, just slightly, enough to be felt. "Load variance is stabilizing," the junior engineer reported, his voice cautious, as if not wanting to break the moment by naming it too soon. Naomi did not react, did not look up. She continued working, adjusting, guiding, always one step ahead of where the system was trying to go, not chasing it, but anticipating it. "We are not done," she said, her tone unchanged. "If we stop here, it will drift again." She moved to the origin point she had identified earlier, the first divergence, the place where everything had begun to separate. Her hand hovered for a fraction of a second, not from doubt, but from precision. Then she entered the final sequence, not to reset the system, but to realign its foundation. The screens responded slowly at first, then more clearly, the lines beginning to draw closer together, not perfectly, not instantly, but steadily, the kind of correction that held because it was built from understanding, not force. The tones softened further, blending back into the background, no longer demanding attention, just existing. "We are regaining synchronization," the senior engineer said, this time with certainty. The room exhaled without realizing it had been holding its breath. Richard's gaze remained fixed on the screens, but his focus was no longer on the numbers. It was on her, on the way she had moved through a system he had built and seen something he had not, something he had chosen not to hear when it mattered most. Naomi finally stepped back slightly, not fully leaving the console, just creating enough space to observe the system on its own. The lines now moving together, the pattern no longer fractured, but whole. And in that quiet shift, without announcement, without celebration, the system returned to something it had never truly been before, not perfect, but understood. The system did not celebrate its recovery. It simply continued, the lines on the display now moving in quiet alignment, no longer fighting each other, no longer drifting apart, just steady, consistent, the way they should have been from the beginning. The tones that had filled the room softened into the background until they were barely noticeable, replaced by a low, even hum that no longer demanded attention. Naomi stood still for a moment, watching, not trusting the first sign of stability, but waiting for confirmation in the pattern itself, her eyes moving across multiple screens, not searching for errors, but for rhythm. And when she finally stepped back fully from the console, it was not with relief, but with certainty. "It will hold," she said quietly, her voice not announcing success, just acknowledging it. The room did not respond immediately, as if everyone needed a second longer to believe what they were seeing. The senior engineer leaned closer to his monitor, running one more diagnostic, one more check, his fingers slower now, more careful, and then he exhaled, the tension leaving his shoulders in a way that could not be hidden. "Stability confirmed across all sectors," he said, his voice steady again, but carrying something new, something like respect. The others followed, verifying, confirming, each screen reflecting the same conclusion, not perfect, but controlled. Richard remained where he was, his gaze fixed on the central display, but his attention no longer on the system. It had shifted entirely to the space beside him, to Naomi, who had already turned slightly away from the console, not waiting for acknowledgement, not expecting it. Her focus already moving forward, as if what she had done was not extraordinary, but necessary. "You should monitor the redistribution for the next 24 hours, she said, addressing no one in particular. Yet everyone listened. "Do not force adjustments unless the pattern breaks again. Let it stabilize on its own." The engineers nodded, not because they had been told, but because they understood now why it mattered. Richard finally spoke, his voice quieter than it had ever been in that room. "Naomi," he said, and for a moment, that was all, just her name. Spoken without title, without distance, she turned to look at him, not expectant, not guarded, just present, the same calm that had been there from the beginning. "Thank you," he added, the words simple, but heavier than anything he had said before, because they were not part of a negotiation, not part of a strategy, just recognition. Naomi held his gaze for a brief second, then nodded once, not dismissing it, but not holding on to it either. "You should have listened the first time," she replied, her tone even, not accusing, just honest, the truth placed where it belonged. And for the first time, Richard did not respond with defense, did not explain, did not justify. He simply nodded, accepting the weight of it without trying to shift it away. Around them, the room had already begun to return to its usual rhythm, screens glowing steadily, Voices low, but no longer tense. People moving with purpose instead of urgency. But something had changed, not in the system, not in the data, but in the way. The space held itself, quieter, more aware. Naomi reached for her jacket, draped over the back of a chair, slipping it on with the same simple motion as before, not lingering, not waiting for anything else. She moved toward the exit, her steps soft against the polished floor, and as she reached the door, she paused just long enough to glance back once, not at the screens, not at the engineers, but at Richard, a brief moment, a silent acknowledgement of what had passed between them. Then she opened the door and stepped out, the light from the hallway catching her silhouette before it disappeared, the door closing behind her with a soft, quiet click, and this time, the sound did not echo with tension. It settled into the room like something understood, something that would not be ignored again. The room did not return to what it had been before, even as the system continued to run smoothly. Even as the numbers aligned and the screens displayed nothing but stability, there was a difference now, something quieter, less certain in the way people carried themselves, the confidence that had filled the space earlier replaced by a kind of awareness that did not need to be spoken. Richard remained standing near the central console long after Naomi had left, his reflection faint in the glass. Layered over the data he once trusted without question, he watched the system not as its creator, not as its owner, but as someone who had nearly lost it, the difference subtle, but permanent. One of the engineers approached cautiously, holding a tablet. "We have prepared a report on what happened," he said, his tone respectful, measured. Richard glanced at it briefly, then shook his head slightly. "No," he replied, not dismissing the work, but the idea behind it. "We do not need a report to tell us what happened." The engineer hesitated, unsure, then nodded and stepped back, understanding that this was not about documentation. It was about something that could not be summarized in data points or timelines. Richard turned away from the screens and walked slowly across the room, his steps quieter now, less certain, stopping near the door where Naomi had exited, the same door he had ordered her through hours earlier without a second thought. He stood there for a moment, not touching it, just looking, as if the memory of that moment still lingered in the space itself, the tone of his own voice, the ease of his dismissal, the way he had chosen not to see what was right in front of him, behind him. The system continued its steady rhythm, the sound of it no longer impressive, just present, like something that had been given another chance. Richard finally reached for the door, opening it slowly. The hallway outside unchanged, the same lights, the same quiet, but it felt different now. Not because the space had shifted, but because he had. He stepped out, pausing just beyond the threshold, looking down the corridor where she had walked away. The distance between that moment and now measured not in time, but in understanding. He did not call after her, did not try to follow, not because he could not, but because he knew that what had needed to happen already had. The lesson was not something that required her presence to complete. It had already taken hold. He closed the door. Gently, the sound soft, deliberate, not final, just aware, back inside. The team continued their work, quieter now, more careful, each adjustment made with a little more attention than before, and at the center of it all, the system ran, not perfectly, but honestly, reflecting not just the design behind it, but the moment it had nearly failed, and the person who had seen it coming before anyone else chose to listen. The next morning, the light in the control room felt different, softer as it filtered through the glass walls, no longer reflecting urgency, but something quieter, steadier. The system continued its rhythm without interruption, lines moving in clean alignment, no flicker, no hesitation, just a steady flow that no longer demanded attention, and yet no one ignored it now. Every engineer who passed by a screen slowed, even if just for a second, eyes scanning not for problems, but for patterns, learning to see what they had missed before. Richard stood alone near the central console, jacket off, sleeves rolled slightly, not out of necessity, but habit, his gaze resting on the display without the same confidence it once held, not because he doubted it, but because he understood it differently. Behind him, quiet footsteps approached, the senior engineer stopping just short of speaking, waiting. "We ran the overnight data," he said finally, his voice calm. "The system is holding exactly as she predicted." Richard nodded once, not surprised, not relieved, just acknowledging what had already been proven. Good, he replied, the word simple, but carrying less ownership than before. The engineer hesitated, then added, "We also reviewed the early fluctuation logs, the ones she noticed." He paused briefly, choosing his words carefully. "They were there, we just did not think they mattered." Richard's eyes shifted slightly, not to the engineer, but to the reflection in the screen, his own face layered over the data. "They mattered," he said quietly, not correcting, just stating what could no longer be ignored. The engineer nodded and stepped back, leaving him alone again with the system, the hum of it steady, almost quiet now, like something that had settled into its place. Richard reached forward, not to adjust anything, just resting his hand lightly against the edge of the console, feeling the faint vibration beneath the surface, a reminder that even stability was something in motion, not something guaranteed. His mind returned, not to the failure, not to the moment of crisis, but to the moment before it, the one he had overlooked, the one where a voice had spoken and he had chosen not to hear it. That was where everything had begun, not with the system, but with him. He straightened slightly, his hand dropping back to his side, and turned toward the door, not hesitating this time, not pausing to consider, just moving with a decision already made. The hallway outside greeted him with the same quiet as before, but his steps carried something different now. Not urgency, not pressure, but intention. He did not head toward the boardroom, did not return to the office where decisions were usually made. Instead, he walked past them, toward the lower levels, toward the spaces he had rarely entered without purpose. The maintenance corridors, the quieter parts of the building where the work that held everything together happened without recognition. The smell of cleaning solution faint in the air, the sound of distant footsteps echoing softly. And for the first time, he did not pass through quickly. He slowed, his eyes moving across the details he had never needed to notice before. A cart left neatly against the wall, a panel slightly ajar. Small signs of attention that had always been there, just unseen. He stopped near the corridor where he had first seen her on the screen, the same place she had paused, the same panel she had opened. He looked at it now, really looked, not as a piece of infrastructure, but as a point of connection, a place where something small had revealed something much larger. He did not touch it, did not open it. He simply stood there for a moment, understanding that what had changed was not the system, not the building, but the way he saw it. And as he turned to leave, his steps slower, more deliberate, the silence of the corridor no longer felt empty. It felt full, filled with things that had always mattered, waiting for someone to finally pay attention. The building settled into its usual rhythm by late afternoon, the kind of quiet efficiency that did not draw attention to itself. Footsteps moving in measured patterns, screens glowing steadily behind glass walls, conversations low and focused, but beneath it all, something had shifted, not in the structure, not in the system, but in the awareness that now lived inside it. Richard stood once more in the control room, not at the center this time, but slightly off to the side, watching as the team moved through their tasks with a different kind of care, not rushed, not tense, just attentive. The systems hummed steady, almost unnoticeable now, like a breath that no longer struggled to find its rhythm. He did not interrupt, did not direct, he simply observed. And in that observation, he saw something he had missed before, the small pauses, the second glances at data, the willingness to question what seemed stable, the space that had been created for voices that did not always carry authority but carried truth. He turned slowly, his gaze moving across the room until it rested on the door, the same door that had closed behind her, the same door that had once marked the end of a conversation he had refused to have. He walked toward it, not with urgency, not with hesitation, just with intention, and when he reached it, he paused for a moment, his hand resting lightly against the handle, not to open it, but to acknowledge it. The memory of that moment no longer sharp, no longer heavy, but clear. He opened the door and stepped into the hallway, the lights softer here, the air quieter, the sounds of the control room fading behind him. He walked the same path he had taken earlier, past the maintenance corridors, past the small details he had once overlooked, but this time, he did not stop. He continued until he reached the exit, the glass doors sliding open as he approached, the outside world waiting beyond them, unchanged, people moving, cars passing, the rhythm of life continuing without pause. He stepped outside. The air cooler now, the light beginning to fade into evening, and for a moment, he stood there, not moving, not thinking about the system, not calculating outcomes, just present in a way he had not allowed himself to be before. Across the street, a figure moved past the corner, a glimpse of a familiar posture, steady, unhurried. Naomi, walking away from the building as she had done before, not looking back, not waiting, just moving forward. Richard did not call out, did not step into the street. He simply watched, understanding that what needed to be said had already been said, not in words, but in actions, in choices. In the space where he had finally listened, she disappeared into the flow of the city, just another person among many, but not invisible, not anymore, not to him. He exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him without weight, without urgency, and then he turned back toward the building, not as the man who had walked out earlier, but as someone who carried something different now, something quieter, something steadier, something that did not need to be announced to be real. Inside, the system continued to run, not because it was perfect, but because it had been understood, and somewhere beyond the glass and steel, beyond the numbers and the screens, the truth remained simple, clear, and impossible to ignore. She had not needed power to be heard, only the courage to speak, and in the end, that had been enough.